A warm welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining again. Thank you for joining in one of my rumination chats, one of my exchanging of ideas with you. It is my privilege and it's my joy to join you another time. And I want to express my gratitude to people who are also expressing kind sentiments, having watched the two videos that I have already uploaded. Thank you so much. And of course, encouragement sweetens labor. Now, today we are going to talk about, or I'd like to engage you in another topic on on the US empire. And I just want to say here that the US is a wonderful country and God has set up that country. He set up that country originally for people who were experiencing religious persecution in Europe and had to flee. And after that, we've seen where people or peoples from all nations and tribes and kindreds have gone there and they have done amazingly well for themselves economically, politically, and in other spheres of their lives. So the US has played a rather important role in the history of the world. It is a nation of a lot of paradoxes. We understand that human nature is one of many paradoxes, right? We sometimes profess to be something else, but behind the scenes, we might not be the person that we think we are, or the person that we have expressed ourselves to be. Call it hypocrisy, but I think perhaps that is the essence of human nature. Sometimes people smile with you, right? And they might not necessarily mean you well. Sometimes they smile with you while they perhaps are angry with you. Sometimes they want to even kill you, and sometimes they do. So we must understand that the talking about the United States is not talking about her as a wicked and evil country, right? We must understand that there is also a distinction between what governments do and what citizens also do. And I have been emphasizing that on my channel here, that we must distinguish between civilians and also governments. And not all members of governments are also evil. We have people who are honorable, men and women of integrity, and who do the best that they can do to ensure that we live in an orderly and decent society. However, we must also understand that because we do not live in a perfect world, because human nature is not perfect, we must be vigilant and we must be able to assess and to examine even ourselves, our traits, and to see the strengths and the weaknesses of our our nations. So I just want to preface that. I just want for you to be clear on that, but I'm not here to suggest in any way that the US is the most evil nation. And sometimes, so when I'm talking about the empire, I am just talking about the mere reality. That's what the United States is, an empire. Now, we're going to talk about empire in light. I just want to begin here by going to the Latin phrase of empire. And it's coming from the Latin word imperium, right? Imperium or imperium. So we have two Latin words where we can either refer to it as imperium. And this is a word that is often used in English. I have never heard this one before, the imperium. And that means command or control, dominion, sovereignty, a dominion or an empire, right? So all of these words, this is a Latin word from which it is derived, the word empire. Now, interestingly, the verb imperare, right? And this is the Latin verb, right? This is the infinitive. It means to command or to order. All right. So when we talk about an empire, essentially, we're saying one which commands or one which orders. So when the United States goes abroad, it's not there to engage diplomatically. It's not there to negotiate. It is there to command. And when I say command, I'm saying speak, stand, run, right? That is what we call the imperative, right? And you're giving a command and people must follow, or if they don't follow, they might have to suffer the consequences. Now, it's interesting that the word parare, they're saying here to make ready or order. Now, the Italian word for empire, actually, not empire, but the Italian word for to learn is imparare, right? I'm sorry, I can't write it on but it's imparare, imparare. And that is the Italian word for to learn. So it's interesting. I was just making the connection when I saw the word imperare, the Latin word, and the Italian word, which is imparare, I beg your pardon, which means to learn, aprender in Spanish, which means to learn. So imparare in Italian is the same as aprender in Spanish, for those of you who know Spanish, which means the infinitive word, which means to learn. So I just opened up that because I wanted you to understand that the United States cannot be a democratic society. It cannot exercise diplomacy if it is an empire. Because as we've just learned from its etymology, from the Latin, foundation, the root word, the Latin word from which it's derived, that the word imperare, which means to command or to order. It means control, dominion, sovereignty, right? And that's what we have to understand. It's always good to go back to the root of the word that we're talking about. Remember now that English also has a lot of words that are derived from Latin. Now, let me continue this, and I am going to look at Wikipedia. There is a very important, and normally I do not use Wikipedia because Wikipedia, when it was first founded, I think it was very useful. I think it has now turned into a political research engine, a political site that I sometimes am very leery of. I am very, very cautious of this, and I tend not to use it that often, but I thought that they were fair here in terms of, I'm trying to minimize here my thing. I wonder why it's not okay. All right, so let me minimize it. All right, so why is it not? Sorry, give me a second. Let me share my screen. I'm trying to share my screen here. Okay, good. So let me get here to the right. So here we have the Wikipedia site, and it's giving us a historical foundation into US imperialism, which is American imperialism. By the way, the fact that the United States calls itself America, that shows that it has from the beginning imperialistic intentions, right? Because the fact of the matter is that we all live in the Americas, whether you're living in the Caribbean or you're living in Latin America, we all know that we occupy what we call the American continent. So the fact that America suggests that it is America, it means that it wants to suggest that we control the entire American continent. However, that's what it is, and we understand what we mean by American, that it means North Americans or US. Let us say US citizens because North Americans could also mean Mexicans and Canadians. American imperialism is the expansion of American political, economic, cultural, media, and military influence beyond the boundaries of the United States, right? So we're seeing here as number of spheres. We have it in the political realm, economic, cultural, media, and military. And I think I would also add academic, because I think that the universities of the world now are sounding more alike. They are coming up with similar research findings. There seems not to be any sort of uniqueness what's coming out of universities. Even in countries where you do not have certain issues like racism and other things that might be happening in the United States, we find that that is now being taught and being brought to the fore in countries where that might not be or might not have been the history. And but because of what the academics are talking about, we find that it's penetrating all spheres of society. Now, depending on the commentator, it may include imperialism through outright military conquest, gunboat diplomacy, unequal treaties, and among other things. Now, the question of whether the United States should intervene in the affairs of foreign countries has been a much debated topic in domestic politics for the country's entire history. And we have opponents of intervention have pointed to the country's origin as a former colony that rebelled against an overseas king, as well as the American values of the democracy, freedom, and independence. So these are America's core values: democracy, freedom, and independence. Conversely, supporters of interventionism and of American presidents who have been labeled as imperialists, notably interventionism and of American president. Sorry, I'm sorry, I think I'm reading here. Have been labeled as imperialistic. Notably, we have Andrew Jackson, and we have James K. Polk, William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, and William Howard Taft. Now, these persons have been described as imperialists, right? So they have labeled these men, these ex-presidents, as imperialists. Now, I am going to move over into what some of the insights that Chalmers, Johnson have forwarded, have advanced while he was alive. And by the way, Chalmers Johnson was a brilliant academic who taught at the University of California, Berkeley. And he was an expert, a political and economic expert in the field of majored. He actually did his research on China and Japan. So he was an authority in on these two countries, and he studied the politics and the economics of these two countries. So this is no ordinary intellectual. It's a guy I regard him as an intellectual giant, and I say that very sincerely, and I mean what I say. Now, he is talking here in his prologue to the book that he's written, Sorrows. Let me show you on the screen, Sorrows of the American Empire, right? So he's talking, his book is entitled Sorrows of the American Empire. And some of the chapters here, we have imperialisms, old and new, the roots of American imperialism, toward the new Rome, the institutions of American militarism. We have surrogate soldiers and private mercenaries, the empire of bases, the spoils of war, Iraq wars, and he have whatever happened to globalization. And the 10th chapter was the Sorrows of Empire, which is really the title of the book. Now, we're going to look at another time at this topic here, this chapter, specifically the Sorrows of Empire, because he's going to delve into the characteristics of what empires are when they are their apex, the apex of their power, when they are beginning to wane and to die. And that's not going to be a very nice topic in terms of the realities that will uncover. But we have to expose ourselves. We've got to open up our eyes to things which are happening in the US. Remember now, when the US sneezes, everyone is going to catch cold. And I mean people in the rest of the world. So we have to be very, very mindful of what is happening in the United States of America. Now, Chalmers opens up his prologue here, and I think this was powerful paragraph. And this is what captivated me to his book. I was drawn to his book because after reading the first paragraph, it sounded to me like it was coming from Seventh-day Adventist eschatology. And by the way, Chalmers was no Christian. Having read I think 3, 4 of his books now, I can say that he did not have any inclination towards any religion, not to my knowledge. Neither was he a Seventh-day Adventist, but I consider him to be a political prophet, if you will. He's not, of course, a biblical prophet, but one of the things we ought to understand is that God uses anybody, even the atheist, if they're willing to study a subject, as Chalmers was able to do, and to write objectively and honestly on the subject, God reveals a lot of times his purposes through them. All right, but let us read the first paragraph here, and he says here, as distinct from other peoples on this earth, most Americans do not recognize or do not want to recognize. And I think I must pause here. Here Chalmers is suggesting that, let me make this a little bit bigger, the font. Many Americans, they either do not recognize or do not want to recognize, right? It means, therefore, that they are not interested in what the US is doing abroad. And perhaps they're on the side because eventually militarism, right, and the empire will eventually go back to the soil. It will eventually be exported back to the United States. That the United States dominates the world through its military power. Due to government secrecy, they're often ignorant of the fact that their government garrisons the globe. They do not realize the vast network of American military bases on every continent except Antarctica actually constitutes a new form of empire. So here we have an empire that is made up of military bases. So it's not the normal European empires where they have colonies, right? The United States does not have a colony. What they do have are military bases that they occupy. And when they do occupy those bases, they control the country. He continues, our country deploys well over 1 million soldiers, spies, technicians, teachers, dependents, and civilian contractors in other nations, and just under a dozen carrier task forces in all the oceans and seas of the world. We operate numerous secret bases outside our territory to monitor what the people of the world, including our own citizens, are saying, faxing, or emailing to one another. So here, this system is not only set up for people outside of the US territory, right? But it's also set up for people in the US, right? So they're watching and they are surveilling US citizens. Our globe-girding military and intelligence installations bring profits to civilian industries, which design and manufacture weapons for the armed forces or undertake contract services to build and maintain our far-flung outposts. One task of such contractors is to keep uninformed members of the imperium housed in comfortable quarters, well-fed, amused, and supplied with enjoyable, affordable vacation facilities. So here he's saying that the soldiers which are fighting on behalf of the imperium, they are comfortable, right? And they're not going to complain, even though they might see things that some of them might not agree with. And they might also be aware of US aggression to other countries. But because their lives are so comfortable, they are not going to complain. Now, so that is very important because sometimes you have members on the right, the political right in the US, and they will say, wow, the military is going to stand up, they're going to rise up against the government because they see that the government is destroying our civil liberties. But is that true? I think that most of them won't, because most of the soldiers coming who are enlisted in the military, they're coming from poverty-stricken homes, if truth be told, right? And they are living in luxury when they go abroad and living on these military bases. The new American empire has been a long time in the making. And this is very important that we understand that, it has been in the making for years. It's not just overnight. It just did not come into being after 9/11. It has been. Now, this book was written sometimes in 2004, I believe. So Chalmers, knew about 9/11 and he knew about the war on Iraq. By the way, I mean, the author died, Chalmers that is, died in 2010. Its roots go back to the early 19th century when the United States declared all of Latin America its sphere of influence and busily enlarged its own territory at the expense of the indigenous people of North America, as well as British, French, and Spanish colonialists and neighboring Mexico. So he's getting into the history and saying that America has always had that imperialistic ambition and wanted to be an empire. I mean, and that is so interesting because, you're talking about a country that grew out of, it was a colony itself of Great Britain. And one would not imagine that even at that time that they might have been contemplating becoming an empire. It's almost unthinkable. And one of the things that is so important for us to gather and to learn, because sometimes when we learn about the history of our countries, including the US, it is so romanticized that they give you this linear perspective and they think that, wow, yeah, we talk about the US being a colony and then they rose up and they fought against the British and how, they believed in freedom and democracy and the whole virtue and value of independence. And to some extent that is true, but there is much more to the story than that. And sometimes we've got to dig, as I like to use, dig a little deeper to see when, how, and where, and why. Now, with the Second World War, our nation emerged as the richest and most powerful on earth and the self-designated successor to the British Empire, right? So it's almost as if the US and Great Britain, they came together as cousins and they decided that they were going to, pass on the baton of power to the US, right? And that the US would be the leader. Now, sometimes people ask me, why is England listening to the United States? Because England realizes that she has lost her empire, even though he always says that the sun will never set on the British Empire, but it has set, and it did set, and the US is the global empire of the world. In fact, it's the unilateral global power or global hegemon of the world. But as enthusiastic as some of our wartime leaders, particularly President Franklin D. Roosevelt, were for the task, the American people were not, right? So we see here that the elites, including some of our politicians, were ready for that task. But the Americans who read the Constitution and who thought their country, was this country of this gigantic democracy, did not understand that the global elites that lived in the US and that are US citizens or were at the time, some of them would have now been deceased, had ulterior motives, right? And they also had their own agendas that they wanted to follow. And it's very important sometimes when we talk about our countries. Sometimes we say, well, America, or you might say Jamaica, or you might say Trinidad and the Trinidadians. And, when you're talking about the country, you must also sometimes distinguish between the leaders and the citizens, civilians, because a lot of times there is a difference in terms of their agendas. Because even though the elites coming from these countries regard themselves as the nation under which they live, then they have that description, whether they're Trinidadians or they're Antiguans or they're Guyanese or whatever they might be, or Americans. The elites are not concerned about these nationalities. They're just not, because a lot of them have, international diplomacy, or not diplomacy, what's the word now? They have, they are internationalists. and they have those sort of diplomatic, passport, whatever they might hold, and they can traverse to and from, and they have some form of connection. I mean, even though all elites of the world do not have the same agenda, they don't have the same interests, but one thing is common is that they understand that in most cases, they're not working in the interest of the populace. So we need to bear that in mind, that our governments are like corporations, and they are, our nation states are corporations, and they are there to govern and to enrich the financial elites. And we must begin to digest it. It's very uncomfortable. These things are very uncomfortable to digest and to accept, but these are truths that we must understand. And it is deeper than that, but I'm just, for those of you who think that your nation state is a separate country and that, the elites are of Jamaica or the elites of America are different. Yeah, they're different culturally, but they do unite with each other, even the Haitian elites. I'm living in the Dominican Republic, and it's fascinating sometimes when there are conflicts between the two countries that sit on the same island, right? That occupy the same nation on the same island, not the same nation, but the same island. That the elites, when there are terrible conflicts, the Haitian elites are always here, and they come to the DR and they buy up the properties, and in many cases, some of them are connected, their families, they have familial ties. So the fact of the matter is, when the Dominicans and the Haitians, the civilians are, at war with each other, a lot of times the elites are in bed together, enriching themselves from the proceeds of the chaos that they have created in the first place. Now, that is something very serious and something that I don't like to talk about, but it's something that is real, right? We must understand that the agenda of the elites are not common to ours. Now, during the almost 50 years of superpower standoff, the United States denied that its activities constituted a form of imperialism. Ours were just reactions to the menace of the evil empire of the USSR and its satellites. Only slowly did we Americans become aware that this role of the military was growing in our country, and that the executive branch, which is called the imperial presidency. So whenever you see the Barack Obamas and the Joe Bidens and the Donald Trumps of the world and the George Bushes of the world, you should understand that they operate in that imperial office. They operated, or they are now operating in that imperial office, or will operate in that imperial office. So it is not an executive branch that is where you have the separation of powers anymore. I think you understand now that I would say the United States, the presidents are benevolent kings, right? If you will, they are not, they're not aggressive. Well, they're aggressive, but not necessarily on the soil. They're aggressive to other nations, and eventually they will be aggressive to members of their own nation. All right, they will just be a monarchy as you had the British monarchy, but because there are still elements of the constitutions and principles of the constitutions in their way, they are trying to shred every principle as it is now that they can from the constitution, so that they can be fully a full-blown king and queen, if you will. Now, by the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and with it, the rationale for American containment policies, I should say the rationale here, the word is rationale. Our leaders had become so accustomed to dominance over half the globe that the thought of giving it up was inconceivable. And this is something very important that I need to highlight. The fact is that the United States, as an empire, as all empires do, love wars, right? And wars are profitable for people who are engaged in them, for the contractors, right? And for the arms manufacturers, and lots of other people who are engaged in these wars, for scientists who do research, because you're going to find out, as Chalmers Johnson is suggesting, that even academia is involved in this empire. Many Americans simply concluded that they had won the Cold War and so deserved the imperial fruits of victory. A number of ideologists began to argue that the United States was, in fact, a good empire and should act accordingly in a world with only one dominant power. So many Americans were living in a sense of delusion, right? They thought that the United States, though she was an empire, is acting in the good interests of other people. At least she's spreading freedom and democracy around the world. But is she? Now, we have to move on. Americans like to say that the world changed as a result of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. It would be more accurate to say that the attacks produced a dangerous change in the thinking of some of our leaders, who began to see our republic as a genuine empire, a new Rome, the greatest colossus in history, no longer bound by international law, the concerns of allies, or any constraints in its use of military force. Now, I want you to understand, because we've had, after 9/11, representations of the two political parties. We had, after 9/11, the Republican Party was in office, and, Barack Obama came in 2008. And we've had, again, another Republican president, and we now have another Democratic president. So we have seen where, even though they might have this sort of different ideologies that they have, one says that they're that they are multilateral, and the other say that they're unilateral, and that one has an isolationist, or claims to have, the Republican Party, as they say, have this isolationist view of the world, and the Democrats have this, progressive view of the world and globalist view of the world. They do not want to have a shared empire. No empire wants to share its power with the world, right? And the United States is clear on that. So we don't need to hear from the Democrats who are pretending as if they do not prefer to have this unilateral global hegemon. They do. They do not want a shared power, not even with their allies, right? The United States does not want to share its power with Great Britain. The United States does not want to share its power with Germany. The United States does not want to share its power with France. And a lot of times we tend to couch our discussion of these people, the Western civilization, in the grand theme of racism, that, the United States and Great Britain and Germany and, they're all united in having the same purpose because they're all whites. But it doesn't work like that, because if it did work like that, why did we have World War II and World War I, right? We all know that the Europeans hate each other, and they were killing each other on their own soil. So there is no such thing as a white culture. All right, that's a farce. And I think we also need to get that in our heads. What we do have are different cultures and nations and linguistic differences. So the Great Britain, even though she acknowledges that America has the global power in the world, I do not think that America would want to share her power with Great Britain, even though they work together at some times to achieve common purpose, but to achieve America's purpose, because America does not have any allies, as they like to say. She has one, interests. So whatever collaboration that they perform, it is because America is seeking to achieve its own interests. Americans may still prefer to use euphemisms like lone superpower. But since 9/11, our country has undergone a transformation from republic to empire that may well prove irreversible. All right. So right now we are at this point, the United States is at this point where its empire might not be able to be reformed. It just cannot be reformed at this given moment. It suddenly became un-American to question the Bush administration's war on terrorism, let alone a war on Iraq, or on the whole axis of evil, or even on the 60 or so countries that the president and his Secretary of Defense announced contained Al-Qaeda cells, and so were open targets for unilateral American intervention. All right. So I'm here again emphasizing that the empire does not want you to express democratically your opinions, right? She does not want any sort of recommendations, any sort of diplomacy, right? America is an empire. It controls, right? It commands. So it commands both its citizens in the US as well as outside of the US to do its bidding. And it's very important we understand that, because it's not that they're having, even the democratic elections are controlled. And many people do not like to come to grips with that reality. It almost seems like, yeah, we're waiting for a president to come and change things in Washington, but who's going to do that? Because the president occupies an imperial office. He is not, in any sense, a democratic president. Hopefully he's democratically elected. Some people still believe that. And I do hope that that is the case. I do have my disbelief where that is concerned. I think that that process is also equally controlled. And why would we think that if you have an imperial presidency that you would have a democratically elected president? Why would you even entertain that sort of idea? It's time for us to think. We must understand that it cannot be that the president is going to be holding an imperial office where he's under this great imperium and then be democratically elected. It doesn't make any sense. Perhaps it does to you. It doesn't make any sense to me. Now, hear what Chalmers is saying here. The media allowed themselves to be manipulated into using sanitized expressions like collateral damage, regime change, illegal combatants, and preventive war, as if those somehow explained and justified what the Pentagon was doing. So the media are also playing a very, very important role in the expansion of the empire. And we've seen here that he's being nice to them, they allowed themselves to be manipulated. And I think that he's right. I think that they deliberately did that because it was the way in which they would be able to be in good standing in the empire. Many journalists sometimes are castigated for revealing truths that the empire would not like them or does not like them to reveal, to uncover. Now, I would like to look at this here. Like empires of old, ours has its proconsuls, in this case, high-ranking military officers who enforce extraterritorial status of forces agreements on host governments to ensure that American troops are not held responsible for crimes they commit against local residents. So we here see where these status of forces agreements, which I learned from Chalmers, I did not know about these agreements that governments, that the US government has with other governments. I mean, those countries in which they have military bases. Now, what they do is that these agreements will exonerate any soldier from any sort of illegal undertakings that he might have, or any illegal activities in which he was engaged in the country, whether it be rape or whatever he might have done, he or she might have done. They will be fully exonerated because, the agreements, the status of of forces agreements does acquit them of any, unjust act that they might have participated in. For example, slowly but surely, the Department of Defense is obscuring and displacing the Department of State as a primary agency for making and administering foreign policy. Now, Chalmers wrote this book in 2004. And to some extent, America was in a better state then, even though it was getting chaotic then. That was, post 9/11. So we had the Patriot Act law already written and ready to be enforced. And Bush was in Iraq at that time, but it still had not yet morphed into this undemocratic state that we're now seeing in many cases. We didn't have the level of censorship that we're having now. At least the papers, even though they allow themselves, as according to Chalmers, to have been manipulated by the imperium, but to some extent, sometimes you would see some investigative journalism coming out now and again, and some things would be revealed. In today's world, we're seeing where they're now censoring not only journalist speech, but they're censoring our speech, right? That we cannot say anything. For example, the war between the Palestinians and the Israelis, we're finding that it is prohibitive to speak against U.S. occupation or U.S. Support of Israel. That to me is really very worrisome. And we should think carefully about where we're going as far as that is concerned. Now, I want to highlight what Chalmers is saying here. He says, like most other Americans who are not actively involved with the armed forces, I paid very little attention to our empire of military bases until February 1996, when I made my first visit to our de facto American military colony of Okinawa, a small Japanese island that we have continuously occupied since 1945. Now, he's now telling us about, he's going to Okinawa because he heard about some, soldiers there raping a citizen of that island in Japan, and how, because of the state of forces agreement, that soldier was acquitted. So he was there to research and investigate and see what was going on. And then he realized that these actions or these activities were not uncommon. They were not something that was the norm. These were the norms. This is what the military did when it occupied territories abroad. He says here, after visiting Okinawa, I began to research and write about the history of our military there, from the final bloody battle of World War II against the Japanese army to the attempts of the senior U.S. officers and Department of Defense officials to trivialize the rape of September 4, 1995. My perspective was that of an academic. I had spent my life as a university professor studying the politics, and I want to listen to this because this is very, very profound. I had spent my life as a university professor studying the politics and economics of Japan and China, not as an analyst of America's global military hegemony. So in this case, he's saying that he spent all his years, and Chalmers is a brilliant guy, was a brilliant scholar. Now, but he never, in all his studies of politics and economics of Japan and China, he never studied these areas in the context of American global military hegemony. Now, that is something that we need to think about, because how often do we talk about science? And when we talk about science, do we talk about science in light of American global military hegemony? When we talk about religion, do we talk about religion in the context of America's global military hegemony? When we talk about economics of any country, do we talk about it in the context of America's global military hegemony? And these are the things that we need to think about when we think about the pandemic. Do we talk about the pandemic in light of, in the context of America's global military hegemony? And I think that we need to talk about these things in light of these things because America is an empire. And many people could not agree that they cannot separate, or they think that there is no link, there's no connection between the imperium and all spheres of the US institutions. Yes, there has to be. It's a body, right? You cannot separate the parts of the body, even though there are different parts, but they connect to one body. And so even though you have different institutions like your academic, and you have your political institutions, you have your religious institutions, you have your economic institutions, but they all connect and they form a whole to this grandiose imperium called the United States of America. And I think we need to understand that. Now, I want to end here because, Chalmers went into a lot of things that we need to read for ourselves. I encourage you to read this book. You'll find that a lot of what he's talking about are relevant to what we're seeing happening in the US as we speak. But let me read the last paragraph because I want to end this video. I think the video is long enough, so let me end it now. As militarism, the arrogance of power, and he's referring to, now there's a difference between militarism and having a military. Chalmers is obviously not against having a military because he understands having a military is there to defend the country from unseen danger, right, and unseen wars. However, is when he's talking about militarism, and he defines it here as the arrogance of power, when you use your power to control and to dominate the rest of the world, right? So as militarism, the arrogance of power and the euphemisms required to justify imperialism inevitably conflict with America's democratic structure of government and distort its culture and basic values. I fear that we will lose our country. If I overstate the threat, I'm sure to be forgiven because future generations will be so glad I was wrong. The danger I foresee is that the United States is embarked on a path not unlike that of the former Soviet Union during the 1980s. The USSR collapsed for three basic reasons: internal economic contradictions driven by the ideological rigidity, imperial overstretch, and an inability to reform. Because the United States is far wealthier, it may take longer for similar afflictions to do their work. And now he's talking here now in 2004. So the US was wealthier at that time. But let's fast forward to 2023 with over how many? $31 trillion in debt. Is she wealthier? At this point, perhaps she is still, yes, because her dollar is the reserve currency of the world. So the US still can wield that. But if America should lose that status, the dollar should lose that status as the global reserve currency of the world, things might change for the United States of America. But the similarities are obvious, and it is nowhere written that the United States, in its guise as an empire dominating the world, must go on forever. All right? And, let me close here this paragraph. American leaders now like to compare themselves to imperial Romans. And even though they do not know much about Roman history. They don't know much Roman history, as he suggests here, sorry. The main lesson for the United States ought to be how the Roman Republic evolved into an empire, in the process destroying its systems of elections for its two councils, its chief executives, rendering the Roman Senate impotent, ending forever the occasional popular assemblies and legislative commission that were at the heart of the Republican life, and ushering in permanent military dictatorship. Now, do you think the United States might be heading to a permanent military dictatorship? Do you think that was maybe possible? Or do you think that might be something far-fetched from reality? I do think that we are heading for some very dark days if we do not find a clear path to change the direction in which the world, particularly the United States, is going. Militarism and imperialism are not good remedies, are not good medicines for the world. So we need to be aware, and we need to educate our children and our families and our friends to know that we are heading in a direction that might lead to the destruction of a Western civilization that many fought for, and it took a lot of sacrifices to have built. I thank you again for joining me, and I hope that we will be able to see each other again, and I can engage you in another topic. Thank you so much, and all the best. Bye.